I'm the Executive Director of HD Reach, and this evening I'm very excited to welcome everyone to the second webinar in HD Reach's education series. This is called the Express Lane, Learning About Clinical Trials. The education series is possible because of generous sponsorships provided by the following organizations: Teva, Neurocrine, Unicure, Genentech, Sage, PTC, and Wave. I'm going to start by going over a few housekeeping issues, and I'm going to remind everyone you can register for the May 15th in-person education conference called The Road Ahead, Providing Your Pathway to Preparation and Progress. This conference is a free event. It's taking place in Raleigh, North Carolina, and you can please see our website at www.hdreach.org to register and to learn more. And tonight I'm so excited because we have three esteemed HD experts who are going to lead a discussion on clinical trials. During their presentation, everyone's microphones and cameras will be turned off. You are encouraged to ask questions anytime just by using the chat button. During the last 10 to 15 minutes of this program, we're going to share your questions with the panelists. Now, before I mute myself, I just want to thank you for attending this webinar and for your interest in advancing research for treating Huntington's disease. And I especially want to thank our panelists for their amazing work and their dedication to the HD community. And Dr. Fagan, would you like to get us started now?
Sure, thank you very much. My name is Dr. Andrew Fagan. I'm a movement disorder neurologist, and I've been specializing in Huntington's disease and taking care of patients with Huntington's disease, doing clinical research in Huntington's disease, really my whole career, more than 25 years. I'm a professor of neurology at NYU in New York City, and I've been the chair of the Huntington Study Group for the past 4 years. First of all, let me thank all of you for joining today and thank HD Reach also for inviting us to speak today. I thought what I would do is give you an overview of this organization that I've been the chair of for the past 4 years, the Huntington Study Group, and talk about some of the clinical trials that we've been involved in doing. So let me just go ahead and share my screen here. So I'm going to talk to you about the Huntington Study Group and what we do. And some of the clinical trials we've been involved in over the years. So the Huntington Study Group, our mission is to seek treatments that make a difference for patients and families with Huntington's disease. And we do a lot of things related to that particular mission. We do clinical research and we do multi-center clinical trials, but we do many, many other things that I'm going to talk about and that you'll be hearing from Dr. Anderson and Dr. Frank about as well. But pretty much everything we do in one way or another is targeting the identifying and finding of treatments that will make a difference for patients and families with Huntington's disease. So what is the Huntington Study Group? We're a clinical research organization that is comprised of a network of Huntington's disease experts, scientists, clinicians, sponsors, people who pay for clinical research, partners, and also of the Huntington's disease community. And we work together to design, conduct, analyze, and report controlled clinical trials, observational studies, and other clinical research on Huntington's disease. But we also have educational programs, training programs, and we engage researchers in the HD community in care and research. And all of this, as I mentioned, is to fulfill our mission of seeking to find treatments that will make a difference for patients and families affected by Huntington's disease. The Huntington Study Group was the world's first and largest Huntington's disease clinical research network. It was founded by Ira Scholson and Jack Penny in 1993, almost 30 years ago. And I believe that was the same year that the gene mutation that causes Huntington's disease was identified. And I think the thinking at that time was, well, Huntington's is a relatively uncommon disease. We're gonna have to work together to do the kinds of clinical trials that are necessary to identify therapies that help people with Huntington's disease. And I think it was no accident that this formed at the time that the gene was identified, because there was high expectations that the identification of the gene would ultimately lead to promising therapies and the need to do clinical trials to prove that these therapies could work. So that was the basis for the founding of the Huntington's Study Group. And it's really still what we're all about. We're about working together to do multi-center clinical trials and clinical research to try to find treatments that will help people with Huntington's disease. We currently have over 800 members of the Huntington Study Group at 100, actually more than 127 sites from all over the world. And at our sites, we estimate that we're about more than 20,000 Huntington's disease patients are being seen and taken care of. I mentioned that one of the major things that we do is our multi-center clinical trials. And in fact, in the 28 years or 29 years that the Huntington Study Group has been in existence, we've done 38 clinical trials or observational studies in Huntington's disease. In this slide, I just show 3 of our most recent studies. You may have heard of some of these trials. We did the Signal trial, which was launched in 2015 and completed in 2020. This trial, although it did not meet its top-line results, which were reported in September of 2020, the drug did look like there was a suggestion that it could have been helpful for patients in terms of thinking and cognition. And so I think I have written here more to come. We're hoping that there will be additional trials of this drug to try to demonstrate that it can help thinking and memory in patients with Huntington's disease. More recently, we've completed the Connect HD trial and the open label extension of that trial called Connect HD2. This is of a drug called valbenazine to suppress chorea in patients with Huntington's disease. And this was a trial that was launched just before the COVID pandemic started and really was conducted during the COVID pandemic. And the top line results were released fairly recently and were positive, showed that this drug does in fact suppress chorea in patients with Huntington's disease and in fact achieved some other secondary outcome measures. So we're hopeful that this will lead to another FDA approved treatment for patients with Huntington's disease. By the way, the other two the FDA approved treatments for Huntington's disease, also for chorea, which are tetrabenazine and deutetrabenazine, were those trials, the trials that led to the approval of those drugs were also done by the Huntington Study Group. And then finally, we have another big ongoing international trial of a drug called pridopidine to see if it can slow the decline of function in patients with early stage Huntington's disease. And this trial was launched during COVID and managed to enroll almost 500 patients at 60 sites, 30 in Europe and 30 in North America, between October of 2020 and October of 2021. And it's an ongoing trial. It's going to look at a measure called the total functional capacity as the primary outcome measure over the course of 65 weeks in these patients. Last patient, as I mentioned, was enrolled in October of 2021. And so you could, 65 weeks later would put us into the beginning of 2023 when we're expecting to wrap up the trial, and hopefully sometime in the beginning of 2023, maybe the second quarter of 2023, have some results to report about the results of this trial. But the HSG does a lot of other things, as I mentioned, to help move things forward in terms of finding treatments and doing clinical trials for Huntington's disease. So we're working on developing virtual ways of assessing patients and participants in clinical research. And so Dr. Frank today will be talking about a project that he's leading called, you can see it at the bottom here, the VUHDRS. The main measure that we use to assess people in clinical trials with Huntington's disease is a scale called the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, which was developed by the Huntington Study Group. And we're now we're doing a study to validate a method for doing this virtually through these kinds of interactions that we're having tonight. And so Dr. Frank will tell us more about that. We're also developing other kind of novel measures and things like wearables and sensors. And we did, in fact, use a biosensor in a recent clinical trial in the Connect trial that I mentioned. We've had some experience in developing a mobile app for assessing Huntington's disease. And we're just recently, within the last week or two, launched a project called My HD Story to try to help develop a novel patient-reported outcome measure that can be useful for assessing how patients participating in clinical trials are responding, and if the therapy or if other therapies are making a meaningful difference to people in terms of living with Huntington's disease. And so Dr. Anderson will be telling you about this new project called My HD Story. Some of the other things that we're involved in are education programs. We have a program called CME for HD, which stands for Continuing Medical Education for HD, to train caregivers on how to take care of patients with Huntington's disease. We have education programs for patients and families, and we have education programs for training investigators on how to do clinical trials in the best way. We have a publication called HD Insights, which recently has started a podcast called the HD Insights Podcast. And we also are involved in trying to increase and improve patient access to HD specialty care through a program called HD Net. I'm going to just skip through some of these slides because I already talked about what these projects are working on. Some of the important things I want to mention about Huntington's disease clinical trials that I think the HSG is uniquely addresses and kind of thinks about as we go into clinical trials. It's maybe a little different from other groups that do clinical trials in Huntington's disease because of our interest and our specialization in Huntington's disease. We work on aligning the interests of patients and families with the research interests. So when we design clinical trials, we often look for input from patients and families in advisory boards on what do they think about the therapy, what do they think about the way we've designed the trial, the number of visits, the intensity of the visits, and those types of things. I think the two projects that we're going to be hearing more about today, My HD Story and the virtual UHDRS, kind of also get at this point. We think it's very important to have open communication with people who participate in our clinical research projects and the HD community about the results, about the ongoing, giving ongoing updates on what's happening with our clinical trials, and also with reporting and discussing the results. I'm aware, of course, we're all aware there have been some disappointing results in clinical trials over the past year or two that have been released with the Roche trial and with some other trials. And I just really want to make the point that, first of all, I think it's really important that these kinds of results be discussed in detail, questions answered to patients and families who have dedicated so much time and effort to doing these trials. But I also just want to make the broader point that even when there are negative results of clinical trials, we learn a lot. And so disappointing trials like the Roche trial, a lot of information has come out of that trial that will help us do clinical trials better in the future. So I feel I just really want to make that point that even though we're always looking for better therapies and we're disappointed if trials come out negative, we're always going back to the data from clinical trials to find hints about how we could do better in designing future clinical trials. And so these data sets from these clinical trials are really invaluable to us, and we use them all the time. And then finally, we're always dealing with issues with study recruitment and retention. And I think the HSG is really uniquely positioned and uniquely aware of the issues related to patient recruitment and retention in long-term clinical trials for Huntington's disease. And this is something that we're working on all the time and interacting and asking for input from patients and families from all the time as well. So I just want to end there and say a big thank you to all the HD patients and their families out there who have participated in clinical trials, our clinical trials, other clinical trials, who are interested in clinical research, and encourage you to get involved, actually, because you'll be hearing today more about ways that you can get involved. And here's some contact information if you're interested in hearing more about specific clinical trials. And you can visit the Huntington Study Group website to gain more information about the Huntington Study Group and what we're working on. Thank you very much for your attention today.
I'm Dr. Karen Anderson. I'm a neuropsychiatrist at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. This means that I'm a specialist in care of patients with neurological disease who have psychiatric symptoms, depression, irritability, aggression. And today I'm here to talk to you about a project that we've been developing in the HSG for the last couple of years called My HD Story. So as Dr. Fagan said, My HD Story is an online research platform, and it aims to connect people affected with HD to clinical researchers, to medical product innovators like the drug companies that we all hear about, and regulators like the FDA to help them better understand what people with HD want and need. So very quickly, the Huntington Study Group did a survey a few years back to look at what are the gaps in clinical care. And we had about 800 people who responded to this online survey in just a couple of months and helped us identify, what are areas where we really have needs that aren't being met in HD. One of the key recommendations that we found from this work was that we needed to have some kind of an online engagement platform where we could communicate with patients and better understand what their priorities are for clinical research and also for clinical care. So this led to My HD Story, and I'm very happy to say that we have launched our first pilot study on My HD Story, the Making HD Voices Heard study. So this is, again, an online platform done completely from your own home. No need to go to a site. No need to even talk to someone, really, if you don't want to. It's all centralized data collection. So again, you don't have to go to an HSG site. You can do it all through the website. And the thing that I'm really excited about is that it's all self-reported. So you get to report in your own words about what you have in terms of HD symptoms, how much they bother you, how they impact your function, what makes them better, what makes them worse. So a really novel chance for you to tell us about yourself. This is our steering committee. You may recognize a couple of the names here, including Dr. Schulson. We think that this study was a really great idea, and then COVID happened, and now we realize it's an even better idea because so many things have gone virtual. So many of the sponsors, the drug companies that we talk to, are really interested in having assessments that can be done without people having to come into sites in case there's another outbreak of COVID or there's another issue like this. So really, we hope that this will address some of the unmet needs facing HD research and care. We know that when you come into a site to see us, it's for a very short amount of time. And we really want to be able to understand more about what's going on in your daily life between study visits and what things are important to you. We understand that when we develop clinical trials, we don't always align with the priorities that you may have. So we may focus on the symptoms that we think we can treat most easily. They may not be the symptoms that matter most to all of you, and we want to understand that better. We also want to have a centralized way to share new knowledge and data with all of you in the research and patient community. So again, this is a pilot study, the very first study on our platform. This study is only going to be open to people who have an HD diagnosis. In the future, we will absolutely include caregivers, people who are pre-symptomatic, people who are at risk, and others impacted by HD. But for this first study, we're looking only at people with an HD diagnosis. And this is because we're very interested in studying the feasibility of having people with HD do these assessments online and to figure out if there are some assessments that aren't realistic or that people just don't like to do. So this study will have a limited number of assessments. Everyone will do all of the same assessments. And a big part of the study is the user satisfaction survey at the end, where you can tell us what you liked and what you didn't like about the study, and we can learn from it and move forward. So our assessments will include some of the things that you're used to doing if you've done research, like filling out information about how old you are, do you have children, where do you live, what's your employment. But also we'll have some self-reported measures. We'll ask you about daily tasks that you can do, if you can manage your finances, if you can do household chores. And then we'll give you a chance to talk a little bit about how HD affects you day to day. So this is an example of one of the questionnaires that does this. This is the HD PROP, the Patient Report of Problems. And it's designed to capture in your own words what bothers you about HD. How does it affect you? So is it something that affects your ability to remember things, to walk? In what way does this affect your daily functioning? How bad is it? And then are there things that you do to make it better? Are there things that make it worse? We want this platform to be really engaging and easy to use. So we want to give a broad number of people a chance to participate. Anybody with an HD diagnosis can do this platform as long as they can understand English, live in the US, are over age 18, and can ambulate on their own and take care of their own basic needs. So this is, again, an opportunity to report on symptoms and impact in your own words so that we better understand you. This shows you a little bit of what the platform pages are like. As you can see, it's a very clean and simple design. I've got a video up explaining a little bit more about the platform and what to expect when you're doing the studies on the platform. And this shows you, again, some of the criteria I was talking about, including the need to be 18 or older, having internet access so that you can do this on a computer, on a phone, on a tablet, and again, being able to take care of some of your daily needs and manage a bit of your own finances. One of the wonderful features that we have on this platform is that instead of having to type in answers, you can actually talk and it will do a transcription for you. So we're going to be getting these transcriptions. We're going to make them into printed transcriptions that we can analyze. So we're not capturing voice. We're not keeping a copy of your voice that could be identified at any point in the future. And we do have some very good frequently asked questions on our website in case you're having trouble with the study. We also have Lauren Malanga, who's our HSG project manager for this study. So you have a live human available at HSG with whom you can speak if you have trouble. So really, we hope that this platform will engage patients and families and increase access to research, particularly for people who aren't able to come to sites regularly to participate in research. We want the advocacy groups such as HD Reach to use this platform to help them reach new people that they haven't been able to engage before. Certainly, we want researchers to have access to the platform to be able to test out new measures for studies. So maybe if someone has a questionnaire, they could put it up on the platform and see how it performs with people. And then sponsors. So we certainly want the drug companies to use our data to make better studies that really focus more on what all of you want them to. So I'm happy to report that our pilot study has launched and we have a very secure website. If any of you have questions about the website security, I can talk more about that, but rest assured that the data will be encrypted. It will not be shared with anybody in a way that can be identified. Again, if you use a voice dictation, that will all be turned into a transcription, so no actual voice recording will be captured. So in the future, we plan to use the data from the pilot study to create a longer study and also longitudinal studies where we can come back every few months and ask you questions about what has changed, what your new priorities might be. We really want to bring the HD patient voice to drug developers and also to regulators. And we want to be able to share this information with the wider HD community. So this is our website. If you'd like to go there and register or just have a look, take a look at the introductory video that we did and look at our frequently asked questions, or you can just type in myhdstory.org. So thank you again, and I look forward to your questions about the platform.
So I am Dr. Sam Frank. I'm a neurologist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. It's in Boston, and it's one of the Harvard Medical School teaching hospitals. And it's my pleasure to present the information about the virtual UHDRS on behalf of a number of people that have put in a lot of effort into this. The co-PI is Jody Goldstein from the Huntington Study Group. I want to give a little bit of background about the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, about our study design and how we intend to use at least the results from this preliminary study for the future and for now. You've heard this throughout. You probably are aware of the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, or the UHDRS. It's really the main tool that we use to assess Huntington's disease. And it's got multiple sections, in fact, 6 sections. There's a motor section. There's a section to monitor behavior. There's a cognitive section, which is actually broken down into 3 components, the verbal fluency, the simple digit modalities, and the Stroop. And then there are 3 functional scales. And I'd like to highlight the total functional capacity, or just the functional capacity that we then total, or the TFC, since that's commonly used to stage Huntington's disease. There's also the functional checklist and the independence scale. So just to give you an idea that this is not just the motor, but it's a complete assessment of the Huntington's disease. And it's been actually developed over years, long ago. We use it to monitor people in the clinic. This is a scale that's standardized, and as much of the motor exam, at least, is part of the, it's just a subpart of the neurologic exam that's focused on issues that we see in Huntington's disease. We also use this in various components as a measurement of Huntington's disease in clinical studies, whether it is assessing the motor aspects or cognitive aspects, functional aspects. And the regulatory bodies, such as the FDA and in other countries, is used to measure the disease, including stage of disease. And the total functional capacity in the United States and the FDA is one of the key measures. Now, this was published in 1996, and this is still what we used. It was developed by the Huntington Study Group. And just to give you an idea of how old it is, I think many of the people that work for me now have no idea what that little symbol is in the upper right hand. And that is a VCR tape, because that's how it was originally distributed in terms of how to do this. Just to give you an idea of what was going on in 1996 at the time, I think many people are familiar with cell phones. This was the first clamshell phone that was out in 1996, and texting was not a thing, but there was the beginning of texting. And so people had to carry around this giant brick, very different era. And so we've moved forward, and we're trying to move forward with some of our scales that we use to assess Huntington's disease as well. And as we've all been made aware, it's really important to be able to assess our patients and research participants in many situations. So, for example, the pandemic, and that we've had many situations in the past, such as hurricanes or snowstorms, at least in my area, wildfires. People may not be able to make it to visits because of car troubles. There may be needs from not just the researcher side and participant side, but driven by our sponsors, whether it's from regulatory purposes, or we really would like more frequent data acquisition with not adding much of a burden. And we've been wanting to do this for a while, but of course, it's much more feasible to do that now. So what's the solution? Telehealth. And telehealth and virtual studies are not new. I just wanted to highlight this. This is Pfizer that conducted the first virtual clinical trial, which allowed patients to participate regardless of geography. And everything about this trial was done virtually, from consent to drug delivery, the assessments, closing out the study and making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So this is a concept that's been around for a little while at this point. It just hasn't been applied as it should be for Huntington's disease. And why not? Hasn't somebody thought of this before? And the answer is yes. There was a pilot study done in 2014, but it was really, truly a pilot study. And if you think about how technology has changed since the initial virtual study in 2011 and this study in 2014, it's been tremendous. To take a look at the speeds that were required, it was kind of jaw-dropping to see how far we've come today compared to just 8 years ago. And so what we are going to do is, this is the objective of the current virtual UHDRS study, and that's to determine the reliability of administering all sections of the UHDRS virtually and compare that to in-person for clinical and clinical trial use. And what is it that we're aiming to do? How are we going to take this beyond the pilot study that was done in 2014? We are going to have about 60 people who are motor manifest. We need something to measure. That's one of the reasons that we have people that are motor manifest. And we want to check all sections of the motor aspect, which is why people need to be able to walk enough to at least take 10 steps. This can be with an assistive device or even with a person, but they need to be able to take 10 steps so that we can see if we can assess walking remotely. People need to be stable in terms of their medications because we don't want that to interfere with any of the assessments. And we don't want people to be actively suicidal. Now, the biggest component is really technical, and that is the ability to obtain satisfactory internet connection at home or the designated location where they're going to be doing the study visits, or with their own or with provided equipment. And so half the patients that participate in the study are going to use their own equipment, and half are going to be provided a Wi-Fi hotspot, a MiFi, along with an Apple iPad. They have to return those, but they're going to be used as a portal so that we can do the assessments over time. And we really wanted this to have low barriers for people. From a privacy perspective, we are not recording anything. The portals that we use, whether it's home-based equipment or the provided equipment, is really just so that we can have a dialogue like we're doing here. Smartphones are great for many situations, but they're too small in terms of the screen and potentially too unreliable as well. So we're not allowing people to have smartphones as their connection. And as I said, if a computer or tablet with a camera are not available, participants are going to be provided a Wi-Fi hotspot and an Apple iPad. The whole study is 4 visits over about a month. 6 weeks is what we anticipate the entire participation. And so there's going to be in-person UHDRS assessment of the complete UHDRS. Then we're going to make sure that people, when they're at home, have the right technology, that there's enough space that people can walk for 10 steps, that there's enough room in the house to do the full assessment. And then we also want to make sure their internet connection is good enough for the assessment. We are going to do a virtual UHDRS assessment as well. That's also going to be remote. And then we're going to bring people back into the clinic and do the full assessment again. So this is the design of this study. Why are we doing this? What are some of the possible uses of the outcome of this study? Of course, we want to improve access to clinic as well as clinical trials. And this may be in the concept, we may use this concept to develop hybrid clinical trials so that some of the visits are done in person, some of them are done virtually. This is, of course, to reduce the burden of people taking time off of work or driving hours in traffic, parking, or just distance. And so this can reduce cost for everyone and reduce time. So not just direct costs, but indirect costs as well. We really would like the Huntington study, as the Huntington Study Group, I should say, we would like this to be an extension of our tool and make it available primarily for clinical research, but we understand it's going to be used for beyond that. And so right now, we all are doing a lot of telehealth. This may come and go over time, depending on circumstances. And this may provide a portal to do more consistent assessments of our clinic patients and research participants over time. This is also a pilot study that should set up the virtual UHDRS for future studies. And we also have regulatory input, people that have been involved in the FDA. I myself have been on an advisory committee, but we need this to be accepted by the regulatory bodies as well. We understand there are many people who are interested in participating and see the uses, the potential uses of doing our assessments remotely. And we, of course, have other populations in mind for the future: patients with non-motor symptoms, pre-symptomatic disease, advanced disease, where it may be more difficult to get into the clinic. And we often use other scales to go with the UHDRS. And so if we don't have to worry about you doing UHDRS or comparing some of those scales to the UHDRS, these are some of the potential future studies that we have in mind after we have made sure that what we measure with the virtual UHDRS is the same thing as the in-person UHDRS. And I think with that, I will end my portion of the presentation, and we have plenty of time for questions.
We did have a couple of questions from our community just prior to tonight, so we can get started there, but I do invite anybody with questions just to type in. And so these questions are general so far. Folks didn't exactly know what each one of you would be presenting on. So as I said earlier, please just jump in if you feel passionate about answering whatever the query is. So this is kind of a general question. What do you think are the most promising types of treatments that will be available soon, specifically for HD?
Well, I mean, I could jump in and take a shot at that. Yeah. So I think, you know, I still think that, you know, if you take kind of a step back and look at what causes Huntington's disease, you know, we know that it's caused by this this mutation in this particular gene on chromosome 4 and the CAG expansion, and that converted into a protein that has an expanded amino acid sequence in it. So we know that causes Huntington's disease, and that's the only thing that causes Huntington's disease. And it kind of sets Huntington's disease apart from other neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease or Lou Gehrig's disease. Those diseases are often multifactorial. There's some genetic causes, some patients who don't seem to have genetic causes. It's a bit more heterogeneous. In Huntington's disease, it's caused by one gene mutation, and that abnormal protein, one way or another, causes Huntington's disease. So I think that if I'm going to kind of make a wager, I think that the therapies that are most likely to have a major impact on the disease in terms of progression of the disease or would be therapies that lower the production of this abnormal mutant protein. And there are several approaches, and it's hard to pick one that I think is likely to be the most successful or most likely to be successful. I know there have been some disappointments with the initial ASO trial that was done, as I mentioned, by Roche. But I guess if I were to say, I think that there are some very promising therapies out there. There's that do lower the mutant Huntington protein. And I guess if I'm going to mention one, I would talk about the small molecule splice modulators that alter that lower the messenger RNA that produces the abnormal Huntington protein. And well, those are in the early phases of clinical trials. We have to wait and see what will happen. But I do think that lowering of the mutant Huntington protein is likely to be the most likely to be successful in altering the course of the disease.
Thank you, Dr. Feagin. Anybody else want to chime in?
I mean, and I think that the fact that there are now small molecule therapies available, meaning they can be taken by mouth, is such a big advancement. I'm very hopeful with these. I think they'll be much more accessible to a broader number of people because in the Roche studies, we found that it took very special patients and families and very special efforts to administer drugs through spinal taps every few months.
And it's possible that by doing repeated spinal taps, it caused problems with inflammation and other issues. Whereas if you can take a pill, you kind of avoid that. But anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, and I would add that even if we could stop HD in its tracks today, we're still going to have people that are symptomatic. And so I think that there are some exciting symptomatic therapies that are in development as well, whether it's treating the motor or the non-motor side of Huntington's disease. So I think that there's a lot of promise there too. I don't think we can ignore the fact that the most exciting is really development of slowing Huntington's disease and working earlier and earlier in the disease process as well. Hopefully we can get to a point where we have people that are gene positive, not yet symptomatic, taking simple drugs that they can take by mouth to delay the onset. And I think that that's perhaps in the foreseeable future, but I think that there are a lot of exciting compounds that are under study today.
Thank you all. I guess the next question is actually a little bit of dovetailing into drugs and when they will be approved. So the next question specifically is, how long does it take from when a drug's, how long does it take from a drug's approval until it's available for someone in the community to take? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, once it gets through the FDA process and the FDA says, we approve this drug, how long does it take from that point till it's available? And the answer is kind of, it depends, right? So if it's a drug that's already on the market for something else, it's immediately available. And that may be the case for some of the drugs that are under study now. If there's a new compound, then there's a lot of steps that need to happen. It usually is within 6 months. It's been a lot faster than that for other drugs recently, but you have to think that you have to know that the FDA has to go into the factories to make sure that the pills are being manufactured correctly, that there's quality control, that when it says it's 10 milligrams, it's 10 milligrams in that pill. And so there's a lot of those types of checks that go in, as well as the label and marketing and what the company can, how they can distribute it to physicians and advertise it to the entire community. So generally speaking, it's about 3 to 6 months once it gets approved before it's available. Now, once it's available, that doesn't mean you can access it, because then insurers will drag their feet many times, and it can take 3 to 6 months after it's even available for pharmacies to have it and for insurers to approve it, getting it from the pharmacy. So there's a lot of moving pieces when it comes to from drug approval to being able to administer it for patients.
This goes back to my point about accessibility also. So it's one thing to get a bottle of pills on the pharmacy shelves. It's another thing if it's a drug that has to be given by an IV infusion into your arm or by a spinal tap, to set up all the logistics or to make sure that all the infusion centers that treat multiple sclerosis or cancer or other conditions are now equipped with this new infusion and getting it on the formulary for the hospital infusion center. So there are a lot of logistics that could go into some of these therapies.
So there's actually a question that it's again along the same lines, and it's taking one step back. Can you talk a little bit about how long it takes after a trial shows a successful outcome for then whatever the medicine that was being tried or methodology, whatever it was, to be then approved by the FDA? So one step back.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll take this one.
Go
as well.
for it.
Yeah.
So it depends on what phase that the clinical trial is. If it's a phase 1, that means it's the first in humans, and we're really just looking at safety and finding one of the right doses. Companies are not going to go to the FDA after a phase 1 trial. Then there's phase 2, which is placebo controlled. We have to compare it against a placebo to prove that it's safe and it works against a control intervention. And even then, the sponsors don't go to the FDA after a phase 2. Phase 3 are the bigger studies that wind up in Wall Street Journal and all the articles. And when it comes to diseases, there are, to rare diseases, excuse me, sometimes 2 trials are not required. If it's something like for hypertension, it's easy to get 2 trials of 1,000 people. But when we're talking about a rare disease like Huntington's disease, it's very difficult to get those kinds of numbers. The FDA still requires an equivalent to a phase 3 clinical trial with what they call a preponderance of evidence. And so if there is a phase 1 or 1 or 2 phase 2s that really are suggestive that the intervention is safe and it works and it does what it says it's going to, then the FDA will sometimes take that evidence in totality along with a well-done phase 3 trial. So it takes a long time to build up enough of a case for the FDA to prove that an intervention is safe and it works and it does what it's supposed to.
I learned something new every day, and that actually was a fantastic way for me to think about that. So thank you. And actually, we have somebody in the chat has a question for you, Dr. Frank. Following up on the first question, how far out do you see the medications being for someone who is gene positive and not yet showing symptoms that would help slow HD?
Yeah, there's,
yeah.
yeah, sorry, I don't know if there was more to the question.
There was one more piece. Also, what does slow HD look like? Months or years? I guess they're asking for more of a little bit more of a descriptive what slowing the process looks like.
Sure. So we measure Huntington's disease right now by the total functional capacity scale, which looks at 5 different components of our functioning in life. And we know that there are different rates of losing points on that scale over time, depending on where you are. And so we from kind of an FDA perspective, we would like to see people not be as fast in terms of losing points. And that's typically over years. Another reason that it takes a long time to kind of show this. And another reason why we really are working on finding better ways of diagnosing and tracking Huntington's disease over time, rather than just that 5-point functional scale. And it's not just over years, sometimes it's longer, like a decade, that we can follow people. In terms of how far out are we from pre-symptomatic, I think it depends. I think that we have to start with treating people who have onset of a disease, right? I could be carrying the gene for Alzheimer's. I don't have Alzheimer's, but I could be carrying the gene for it. Should I be getting an intervention for Alzheimer's? Well, the FDA says I don't have the disease, so I shouldn't be enrolled in a clinical trial, and insurance companies certainly aren't going to pay for it. And so that's a little where we are in terms of Huntington's disease. We need to prove that it works in people with Huntington's disease first, that it's safe in people with onset of Huntington's disease, however we want to define that. And then if it is a disease modifying, to move that needle back and move it into people who are gene positive, not yet symptomatic. But I think that we're going to need to show that it's safe and it works in people who are symptomatic first.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to that. I mean, I agree with your answer. It just is just to point out that it's tricky in people who don't have clinical signs of a disease to demonstrate an effect of a drug, in the sense that you can't use things like the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale, because people will not have significant, may score 0 on the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale when they carry the gene mutation but don't yet have the disease. So what else can you use? I mean, we need to think about using things like biomarkers, imaging of how the brain is changing over time, or other kinds of biomarkers. And you know, I think it's quite conceivable that we will have good biomarkers, or maybe we already do have good biomarkers that could be used in that setting, but convincing the FDA that a change in an MRI is a reason to approve a drug, you know, could be a challenge without showing also that you're delaying the onset of the disease. And so you can just imagine there are some tricky issues in trying to design these kinds of trials. But that's not to say that people aren't doing it, and there are plans for these kinds of trials in the near future. So.
Thank you. It looks like we have time for maybe just 1 or 2 more questions. So this one I've heard echoed for the last year. We all talked about getting some disappointing news over the last year or so with some of the trials. Do you guys have any messages on and Andy or Dr. Feagin, I think you kind of highlighted this earlier, but do you have any messages or suggestions on how our community keeps our hopes up about research?
Well, I mean, I guess I would say, I think, you know, from I have a kind of a perspective that's almost, 30 years long, and working in clinical research and clinical trials in Huntington's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases. And I would say the number of promising therapies in Huntington's disease now, and the number of clinical trials of kind of really novel therapies and really, advanced technology entering clinical trials for Huntington's disease by far more than ever before in my career. So, does that mean that there's a guarantee that one of these is going to work? I guess we'd have to say no, but it does seem awfully exciting and awfully promising, the number of therapies that are out there, and the number of and also our understanding of the disease and things like biomarkers I was talking about and clinical trial aspects about clinical trial design. So to me, it's really all of that put together kind of it makes me hopeful that we can make a difference on the sooner side, put it that way.
Thank you for that. And I think we can kind of close on this last question is, I guess, what is the best way for people in the community, especially folks that are maybe pre-symptomatic or at the very beginning of their HD journey, what's the best way for them to get involved in clinical trials?
I guess I'll jump in there too. There's you can find out about ongoing clinical trials at the government a site called clinicaltrials.gov. You can type in Huntington's disease and find out all the clinical trials that are going on for Huntington's disease. I would encourage you to check out the Huntington Study Group website because we often, we list our clinical trials there, but there's also often information about other clinical trials as well. Probably if you want to draw, cast a broader net, the clinicaltrials.gov website would be the way to go.
Yeah.
Or HD trial finder through HDSA as well.
There's a large observational study called Enroll HD that's open to everyone from HD families. So if you are able to get to one of the HSG sites, I think all the HSG sites are doing Enroll. And it's a tremendous study because it's collected so much information. And it's a worldwide study, which makes it really valuable because we can compare people from different regions of the world.
Yeah, it's great. Oh, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
Just to bounce off of that, I agree. And a lot of researchers are using the Enroll database to find people that qualify for their studies.
Exactly right.
So being connected with a research site for Enroll will almost automatically allow you to be connected if you qualify. I would also encourage you to reach out to your local clinics, assuming that they are busy and large in HSG sites or perhaps even the HDSA Center of Excellence, because a lot of them have newsletters or email lists. I know at my site, we have a repository of exactly these types of patients. So every local hospital and clinic that can provide that research usually has some type of way of tracking people that come through the clinic or are interested.
And as I said, in the future, we hope that My HD Story will have surveys for people who are gene positive or very early symptomatic.
That's a wonderful portal to getting your feet wet into clinical trials, isn't it? Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you all. I am going to ping Debbie Fox Davis if she'd like to step back in. I don't think we have any more questions in the chat box right now. It was wonderful to see you guys, and I will hand it back over to Debbie.
Well, thank you very much. Thank all of you so much. This was incredible information and so much to be hopeful about and so much to recognize there's a lot of work going on. So there's a lot of reasons to know that better things are coming. We just don't know when. I want to thank you all again for being here tonight and all of our participants who are watching right now and getting involved in research to help find the treatments that are going to make living with HD easier. So I thank you all on behalf of HD Reach, and I wish you a great evening. Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.